Welcome to I Like Beer, the book club, where we discuss great books while drinking a beer. It's both that complex and that simple. I'm your host, Jeff Spanier. With me is the co-host of I Like Beer, the podcast, Jeff Riccitelli.
Happy to be here.
And our book and beer friend, author Ryan Woldt.
Hey, everyone. I'm happy to be here too, but I feel like I'm already getting daggers for choosing this book, so I'm a little nervous.
Not for me.
No.
Not for me. You've wrapped up season 1 of Roast West Coast, Ryan?
Yeah, the Roast West Coast podcast, season 1 is entirely done. And now we are just starting to work on, I say we like there's a team. It's me. I am starting to work on season 2, which will have a little bit of twists. In the first season, we focused on coffee education and interviews with local roasters. And in season 2, we're going to be expanding that out and interviewing coffee farmers and some of the people on the production side and adding a whole new education component to it. So I'm excited about it.
I've really enjoyed it. My French press has never been used so much. I'm measuring things, checking temperature, stuff I don't like to do, but I'm finding it does make a difference. So I'm doing it. So thank you. We've talked about it on our podcast.
Yeah.
Well, I'm grateful that anybody is listening at all. I get excited every time I see somebody. And one cool thing is we had enough subscribers that we took all of the subscription money and we used it to buy coffee for local healthcare workers.
Oh, very cool.
So if you show up at Chris O'Brien's coffee shop, Coffee Cycle, which I talk about in the show, he's a partner in the coffee education segment. We've paid it forward and bought coffee for any healthcare workers that show up. They walk right up and they get their free coffee every morning, as many as they need.
That's fantastic.
I picked up some coffee based on your recommendation and listened to the podcast from Libra Coffee, and I know they pay it forward with fresh, clean water as well.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for what you're doing there.
Yeah, no problem. I'd say it's fun because there's so much focus on beer, and which is very valid and worthy, but there's a lot less focus on coffee for some reason, at least so far. And so hopefully this show will be a step in that direction.
Let's face it, you have to drink something before 10 a.m.
That is true.
I did have some coffee whiskey this morning, but yeah, that's
Jeff and I bonded years ago over our fondness for craft beer and telling stories, and we met Ryan through our zeal for beer. Quickly learned that we all three share another passion, the love of books. Yes, we are libationists and bibliophiles on this show. Apparently, we all three love to hear ourselves talk as well. So we
know that no one is listening, but we're still recording and talking. I think that's,
I've listened several times.
I was enjoying the compliments you were throwing our way.
Yeah.
My mom used to say, "Don't laugh at your own jokes," and I now realize as I'm older that that's just for people that are not as funny as I am.
That's exactly right.
I've re-listened and laughed again and again. So that's where we came up with I Like Beer, the book club. Once a month, we join our intellectual powers to discuss a book, share a beer, and we rotate the host based on who's chosen the book. And tonight, that's Ryan, and the book is The Overstory. But before we turn that first page, let's find out what we're drinking and why. Jeff, what do you got?
Going with the theme of The Overstory here, I went to Bergeon. Their logo is a tree, and I've got their Trivana. I figured this was actually immediately when we chose this book, I go, oh, that's the beer I'm going to go find is get some Trivana. And Bergeon here, local brewery here in Carlsbad, and they do all their beers are great. But this is this is kind of one of their core IPAs, their original beers that they started with. So, and I thought it was appropriate for the theme, since the central theme of this book is trees.
I was trying to think of a tree theme as well, so I immediately looked for the tallest beer in my refrigerator.
Nice.
But I decided to go a different route, and I've got a Mother Earth Brewing Buku India Pale Ale, which Mother Earth was one of the kind of the main original craft breweries up in North County. And it kind of reminded me of kind of the roots of the tree and of the concept of the book and of our local brewing scene. And I just wanted to support Mother Earth. We've been kind of talking about them on social media, and they've really been doing a good job walking that fine line between trying to stay open and support the community, but also be health conscious and follow all of the health rules that are out with the new
do it the right way.
COVID health orders.
Yeah.
That's Cameron and Joel over at Mother Earth and my hometown of Vista, or one of my hometowns. I claim several hometowns, by the way.
Your current hometown.
Love Mother Earth. Hey, I'm also drinking Bergeon beer because when I also thought the same thing, and a Trivana West Coast IPA.
There you go.
So Ryan had Virgin Beer last month. Why are they not a sponsor? Does this have something to do with our aversion to making any kind of money, even if it's just money to put back into the system?
I thought you guys were handling the sponsorships.
Yeah.
That's Joe, and we learned something about Joe on our podcast last night about why we're not turning a profit and why he's doing so very, very well.
I see.
Yeah.
I thought it was because of his charitable nature.
It is always very charitable.
And Ryan, you threw this out last week. Virgin Beer with the the COVID situation is very real here in Southern California, and they're doing a fantastic job with delivery. I know, Jeff, you've had deliveries as well.
I have as well. When they first opened it, I was real excited and got a delivery, and that beer didn't last as long as I thought it would.
Yeah,
it's really good.
I would agree, because actually where I ended up getting this is they had their 4-year anniversary, and so it was really cool. They had a meal that was prepared, and they ran you through tastings with their meal. So I did it on Saturday. And then I picked up some extra beer, and as I went into the fridge today, I saved this one for this podcast, but most of it's gone already. So I don't know what that says about how the quality of the beer or how much I'm drinking, but it is.
Well, one of the great things that has come out of this terrible pandemic, but one of the things that I hope stays, is how easy it is to get great beer delivered to the house. I had this Mother Earth was dropped off a few hours ago.
Yeah.
I've got a delivery coming from 3 Punk Ales down in Chula Vista on Friday, and Virgin delivers, and so many great breweries have figured out a delivery system, whether it's through them or through a different service. But that's something I hope doesn't go away after COVID, post-COVID.
Yep.
Cheers to that.
Mm-hmm. We should probably talk about this book.
We might, yes.
Yeah, I'm going to pass the torch on to you. With what I think is going to be a tricky, not that it's beyond you, but a difficult job. I'm really happy to pass the torch. Can you give listeners an introduction to this book and why you were compelled to choose it for this month's selection?
I can, and I think it's funny because you are glad that I'm doing it. I'm glad I'm going to be the one kind of leading it, because I feel like the onus is on you to answer, which I think will be more difficult. But
fair.
So the book is called The Overstory by an author from the Midwest named Richard Powers. This book is important because if you go to the publisher's website, it's right on the front page. So it's obviously a big deal. It's won a ton of awards, Pulitzer Prize, some other awards I've never heard of, like the William Dean Howell Medal. It was on the list for the Booker Prize, bestseller lists across the board. People have bought it and liked it and said nice things about it. It is a very dense book that essentially interweaves the stories of about 9 main characters, and how trees, in particular, 5 particular trees throughout the book, impact their life and connect them through kind of time and space. And it gets quite a bit into how humanity connects with Mother Nature, and the idea that nature is connected on its own without necessarily without us, how trees communicate and trees and other plants communicate and so on, which is an idea that's becoming more and more popular. You see, especially with fungi and mushrooms, there's kind of a big push to understand how the connections between them underground. And this book kind of takes that to another level. And one thing I would say about Richard Powers in his book is the book is dense. It's very thick. It's very heavy. If you're looking for a quick read, this is not your book. And I just for fun, I kind of went to see what other things he's written. I've never read anything by him. And I found this list of topics that Richard Powers has written books about, starting with, and these are all fiction books, mind you. They're all supposed to be fictional stories, but one about the Walt Disney Company and nuclear warfare. He wrote a book about some random farmers from the 1900s that he saw in a photograph. Artificial intelligence experiments gone wild. A chemical company and a woman who succumbs to ovarian cancer who lives nearby. A research team building virtual reality systems while an American teacher is held hostage in Beirut. Interracial couples meeting at a 1939 concert on the Lincoln Memorial steps. A Nebraska man who suffers head trauma in a truck accident, then believes his sister, who is his caretaker, is an imposter. He does not choose light topics, ever. It's
There
not
doesn't-
his thing.
There doesn't seem to be a common
No.
theme that runs through all of his topics either. So
He's known for some technology, for his technology work, or the way he incorporates technology into his books. And he's very clearly choosing specific topics, leaning towards the human exploitation of others, technology, and historical events. And this book, which is his most recent, really feels like where he's taking that lens and he's focusing it on our relationship with nature. And you ask why I chose the book, and it's very simple. I have a younger brother who is smarter and handsomer and younger. He doesn't read much fiction. He generally just reads like stock portfolio prospectuses and medical journals and that kind of thing. But he did read this, and he wondered aloud to me that if I might like it. So I had to find. It was like a challenge. I had to find out if I would, because I could probably count on one hand the number of fiction books he's read in the last 10 years. But that was it. He mentioned it, and the next day I was my turn to pick a book, and I thought, oh, let's go for it. I did no research, and I feel like I was rewarded by it. And with that, I'd like to ask, I guess, what was your first impressions of the book? I'd start with you, Jeff R.
Well, I would agree with you. I think it's definitely when you start reading into it, it's a monumental work, I guess, in a way to look at it, because just the scope and how dense it is. It starts off, like you talked about, with these 9 different stories, and I think initially you're reading this kind of going, "Where's this going?" Because they're not related at all. And then it was really kind of cool to see how he kind of started to bring them together. But I think that's a pretty unique way of writing, where you're really writing almost, like you said, 9 different short stories in a sense, and then all of a sudden you start to bring them together. So I do think for some people that's probably not their cup of tea when they get into reading, because they want to see the story get embedded in with those characters. But I found that I really enjoyed each of the characters individually, and then I did enjoy as they started to come together, and you saw the story kind of come together.
Sure. And I would I've got an alarm going off behind me. I don't know if you guys can hear that, but
Yeah.
it's the beauty of living in the village.
There you go.
On that same topic, I would just enhance that, or I would add to that by saying there's 9 short stories to start the book, but that's 150 pages.
Right.
And so when they don't connect, each of those stories are kind of their own independent thing. And I actually wrote, I think near the end of that, like when is this thread going to start being, I assumed they would be connected,
Right.
but it took a long while to get there.
And there were even a couple that never connected. Really, the what was it, Nile Meta, the guy that does the games? I mean, he really, other than maybe reading about these other characters, and the other one was I think it was Dorothy, because all this they really never connected with the rest of the other characters, which I thought that was kind of interesting, that he never, they kind of stayed on the outside, and they maybe observed.
There were little moments where Neely, I think, sits in on a lecture.
Yeah, that's what
from the
they were
one that they're reading the doctor's book in one part.
Right.
There were just little,
almost
like the synapses of the brain way far away, just on some little spark, where their lives intersected.
But
I
were
could-
almost
Oh, go ahead.
they were almost characters created to push along the other characters in the
Right.
story, but they were given kind of their own focal point in the beginning.
Right.
And that was something I wondered if perhaps instead of 9 main characters, there had been 5, if that would have taken away from the book at all, or if it may have just kind of trimmed it down. And not that those characters didn't exist, just that they showed up in someone else's story as opposed to getting their own focus.
I think you used the word at the beginning to interwovenness of this book. And I think it would have made cleaner, crisper storytelling. I think it would have lost some things in its depth and purpose. I think there was so much talking about a forest is everything in the forest is the forest.
Right.
And I think it needed that motif of the roots of the interconnectedness and interwovenness of these disparate people that may never meet. That doesn't mean their lives don't have an important significance or affect someone far, far away in a whole different life. So I think I appreciated it more the way it is than if it had been streamlined for the reader part of me, the part of me that wants to sit down and burn through a book
to make it easier for you to read.
Yeah, right.
No, like I agree. Like I take that character, that Neely Meta character, because I think that's so much of what I think in some ways that was what do you want to say? It was a way to kind of talk about, we have a lot of people in our, not just in our country, but all over the world that aren't really, I would say, they almost live in a virtual world, right? But through whether it's online, whether it's gaming, whatever that is. And so that's what he kind of was, that character that is here. He's creating these virtual worlds that really, it's just, what are you doing in those? Well, I'm doing the same thing. I build something, I go to work, so you think about people that spend, hours and hours and hours and hours in front of a computer screen or playing a video game, as opposed to say, building something, as opposed to actually going out and building something. So I thought it kind of gave some perspective, or maybe a lens into that's a big part of our society now, are people that do everything, but it's all virtual, it's all online.
Well, this is going to lead to something that I want to kind of close with, but I'm just going to foreshadow a little bit now. But in addition to that part of it, showing these other webs, it also created this much longer, intricate book, similar to the connections between the trees, but it also forced you onto a longer timeline, which is a theme throughout the book, and how we see the world on the timeline of humans, if you're lucky, 70, 80, 90 years,
Right.
if you're lucky. But these trees are seeing the world on a whole different scale. Their timeline is 100 years, 300 years, 600
Right.
years, millenniums, and how we are judging the value of our impact on things on a much shorter scale than nature is around us, which is a really interesting thing. And by having such a long, dense book, it kind of forces you to start thinking on a longer timeline.
Yeah.
Could the story have been done in half the time? Sure. But would you have gotten that kind of step back, which later on I'll ask you before we go, if you'd recommend this book to somebody, so you can start thinking about that now. But that is kind of part of it, is recommending it, and recommending it because you think they'd like it, or recommend it because you think they would appreciate the thinking that came with it, is a different thing than maybe I would normally do with a book. We've thrown out a few of the characters so far, including Neely Mehta, and you mentioned the husband and wife team, which is Ray and Dorothy.
Yeah.
But kind of the core group is a young man from Iowa, Nicholas, and a girl he meets who becomes kind of the I should say right now, if anyone is listening to this and wants to read it and hasn't read it, there are spoilers here.
Yeah,
that should have
sorry
been
about that.
obvious,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think.
yeah.
But there are notable spoilers.
Trees win.
Yeah, there's. I read this quote about the book from the publisher that mentions all of the characters and said that they're people that have these unique relationships with trees, which occasionally lead to tragedy or salvation. But to me, they kind of all led to tragedy, except for the trees, but also for the trees.
True.
And so I don't know how much salvation I was able to call from it, but the book ends up getting broken down into kind of 4 sections. What we just talked about is those short stories in the beginning, the roots, and then there's kind of the trunk, which focuses on Nicholas, this young man from Iowa, Adam, a young man who is kind of a loner, but he's very focused. A woman from Asia, Mimi Ma, who's got some family history, who teams up with another guy named Doug, who's kind of he's the one who's got the most tactile relationship with trees. He spent a lot of time just replanting trees on behalf of cutting companies. But that's kind of the middle chunk of the book, and then it speeds up near the end as we get to like the repercussions of their actions through life. But in the first part of the book, as we're reading through this short stories, was there one character or storyline that you went into that second half, the meat of the book, that was, you're like, man, I really want to find out what happens here?
The Ma family, I think, was my turning point in the book. The Chinese immigrant who smuggles out family heirlooms, perhaps not family heirlooms, perhaps just stolen treasures. And his fascination with the national parks and taking his, caring for his mulberry tree and taking his family out into nature and trying to teach them a Chinese way of thinking and seeing and appreciating, they're growing up in a Western civilization worldview. and he was trying to balance that out. That's pretty much where I got hooked. That's where the story took a turn, where I was plodding through saying, I need to read this for book club. I'm not showing up not having read a book, but it's going to take me a while. And then there was something about that particular story, that character and that family, that hooked me.
Yeah. No, I actually enjoyed all of them, and I think right off the first character, which I think it was that was the Nicholas Hoyle, because I thought it was one of those things where you start reading a book and you're reading, and it's it's fairly mundane and hard, but then right at the end of his initial little short story, it's where he comes back and his whole family's dead. Basically they die of carbon monoxide poisoning, and I went like, whoa, wait, that was like a real wake up. Like this went in a wholly different direction than I was anticipating. I found it was pretty fascinating just reading, like you talked about Adam. I thought there was kind of a common theme through a lot of them, where it was maybe the kids were a little bit loners or some, whatever they had at the beginning. And then it was often it seemed like the father figure played a big role in that, of getting them with nature or something with trees. There was the one family where they planted a tree for every kid that was born. I think that might've been Adam's family. But I thought the one that was really the kind of the coolest one, which was the last one to me, was Olivia's, where she's this college, person who thinks she's got it all figured out and missed school and, that. And then she has her accident and basically, dies and then comes back to life. And all of a sudden now she's in touch and in tune with nature. I thought that was kind of a fascinating, like it was kind of a turn. That's where it kind of turned all of a sudden out. Like it went from these individual stories and into now we're going to start to link these stories together.
That's really where I saw Ryan mention the tragedy and salvation part of the story, that motif that they tell the story, or they explain. The scientist, my favorite character, the plant Patty,
right,
tells a story of when a tree falls, all of the life that's recreated out of that dead log, that none of this force exists without a dead log. And I think I saw a lot of that when I went back and reviewed the story this week, of the tragedies are also a place of rebirth. Sometimes, like with Olivia, it's kind of a literal rebirth. They're supposed to be figurative, but hers is a literal. She dies and comes back, or her heart starts beating again. But some of them died for causes, martyrs, or to push a story forward, a narrative further, to kind of wake mankind up or shake them out of their trance. So I did see some of that as a unique take on salvation.
Well, we got to come up with some sort of system here. With Jeff R, Jeff number 2 to me, he mentioned Olivia was a turning point for him. Olivia's chapter is the last one of all the characters before we move into the section 2 of the book. And for me, I was hooked at Nicholas, but then it lost me and I started to slow down as I was working my way through. And I'm looking at it right now. On the first page of Olivia's story, I wrote, "I wonder who dies?" ? And so there had been a sort of a tragic theme up to that point. And then I started wondering when they were going to connect, which kind of takes me to this next kind of thought, which is that early on, there's a quote in the book that says, "Now the gods are dying, all of them. The full force of human ingenuity cannot stop the disaster breaking over the continent." And Powers is talking about trees at that point, at least literally, but metaphorically, it could apply to a lot of other things. Kind of ultimately, are humans clever enough to figure their way out of the messes that they create? Later on in page 53, it says, "Science, the man figured, would soon come up with a cure." And it kind of, the note I made to myself was that humans have kind of given themselves a savior complex. Like, we believe that we can invent ourselves out of any problems that befall us, even though the problem itself, and this is what Plant Patty, Patricia Westerford, that her character is kind of espousing, is that the problems sometimes themselves, especially with nature, could have been prevented. We didn't have to solve them. We could have just not had the problem in the first place. And the book then, the book seems to imply that life is asking something of us as people. nature is asking something of us. It's trying to tell us like, hey, we're in this together. It's not humans and then nature, it's all of us, which made me kind of wonder if our belief as readers kind of in the importance of trees or in the importance of nature changed while reading this novel. Did it affect like your sense of human uniqueness, so to speak, or in my case, cause my mild terror about climate change to increase? Did you leave the book uplifted or depressed? I mean, where did you see the relationship between humans and nature going as you were reading this book? You know what? I take it back, Jeff. You were right. It's much harder to ask the questions than
I'm going to try to tie this to something we were talking about earlier with this death and the salvation, tragedy and salvation. At the end of the book, it says, page 515, so near the very end, what do all good stories do? They kill you a little. They turn you into something you weren't, which as a literature teacher, this is something I believe on in many levels, but I felt that way. It validated some things that I already have felt about ecology, in environmental sciences, nature. It packaged it into story, into myth, which I'm not a scientist. It's easier for me to understand things told in a story than to read a textbook on them. The hopefulness was there in parts of our immediacy to fix things is a selfish need, just to fix things for us. Nature will be fine. Nature is going to be okay. A natural world that supports what we need is what at jeopardy. And that also brings in the negative side of it, our blindness to what he called on page 410, the Midas problem. Everything humans touch turns to shit, because we can't see beyond ourselves. We can't see beyond.
We can't see the forest for the trees, Jeff.
Really, that's what it is. Thank you. Where's Tom with the rim shot? Because that was perfect. But this immediacy of solutions is immediate for us. Like we can't leave the forest alone. Stuff falls over and we better clean that up. That'll cause fires. And
right.
The truth is, leave the stuff there. That's what creates a stronger, fuller, better forest, which is better for us in every possible way you can think of for the world we live in. I liked when the video game designer revamped the game. So instead of trying to find a way to own the world, run the world, it's you have to save the world. Right. And his fellow designers just laugh at him saying, no one's playing that game. Yeah. And then he loses his stocks in the company.
Well, what you're one thing we're kind of talking about with that is, and what you just brought up is kind of how to determine success or failure in this relationship, and on what timeline is it based? Is it on a human's timeline? Are we successful if we prevent certain aspects of climate change? And on a tree's timeline, are we successful if we eliminate the problem? Which I think got me a little there. And I wanted to move on to this idea of, we haven't addressed it yet, but our core group of characters, Mimi, Ma, Doug, Nicholas, Olivia, they are essentially become a group of eco warriors. And I always think of the phrase that a mission or a passion can make for some strange bedfellows. None of them seem like they should be connected. They come from all different walks of life in all different parts of the country, and yet somehow they've ended up together doing these very intense, very emotionally jarring, ultimately acts of violence on behalf of the environment, trying to get the attention of the world to say, hey, we are making a mistake with how we are treating trees. We're living through a time in which we talk a lot of, we saw a literal mob mentality recently at the Capitol, and which was reinforced, I thought, very emphatically during the presidential inauguration, when they were singing, Lady Gaga, of all people, was singing, and she looked back at the Capitol while she was singing about, the home of the brave and the land of the free. So it made me think a lot about groupthink or mob mentality. There's kind of an analogy in the book where The single biggest influence on what a body will or won't believe is what nearby bodies broadcast over the public band. Get 3 people in a room, and they'll decide the law of gravity is evil and should be rescinded because one of their uncles got shit-faced and fell off a roof. And I thought that was a fantastic line because it took a really complicated idea and brought it to a point where, like, oh yeah, I would be pissed if I fell off a roof. Excuse my language there. But do I blame gravity or do I blame myself for drinking too much? So it felt a very appropriate, and it made me wonder where we thought the book came down on this violent resistance. Was Powers encouraging it? Was he saying, well, maybe it's not the right answer because ultimately their actions lead to imprisonment or even death, or it doesn't quite get the response that they're hoping from the world at large, and then ultimately, if you were to participate in an act of violent resistance, is the prospect of an environmental catastrophe a justifiable motivator for that violence or for that resistance? As an abstract threat, it's harder to discern than a physical one. We're more afraid of than a single person with a gun than we might be for like a company pumping, say, carbon into the atmosphere, right? It's the immediate versus
Immediacy,
the long
yes.
term,
Yeah.
which, of course, now I'm being educated as I'm talking to you guys. Like, it's all about that timeline. So back to the question is, where does the book come down on the idea of violent resistance, and then is it a justifiable motivator?
They're martyrs, and you wonder if anybody heard their story or heard their cry when the couple decades go by. And I thought one of the things I liked his criticism of herd mentality. He didn't take on just attacking humanity. I've read a lot of books that take on herd mentality. When we read Hillbilly Elegy, I think it took on that a bit. But instead of attacking it directly, he kind of works his way around telling a different story. And I think those eco rebels, part of it was a reminder that for most the timeline of humanity, indigenous people lived in balance and respect with as a part of nature without having to have violent protests for or against it, without raping it for what they want, or having to risk their lives to save it. And I thought that was woven in that long timeline of there are other ways to play the game. I think was a quote in there. There are other ways to play the game. It is a very specific worldview that's not interested in playing any other way.
There was one to kind of taking off of Ryan's point, but going back to what you're, I think, and I'm trying to think of what part of the book it was, but there was, they were talking about I think it was more of a family-owned logging company that had worked over many years, decades or whatever, and had done a very good job of sustainable, where it was like more quality versus quantity type of a thing, and they felt like, hey, we can do this, we can log these forests for hundreds of years and still maintain growth and all this other kind of stuff. But then at some point it became where the mighty dollar came in, right, and it wasn't going to be profitable enough, and so then they were bought out by a company. Remember, I can't remember the exact terminology, but they use a way to kind of buy those people out, and then the big business came in, and then that's where they come in and just clear cut everything and kind of go. So I thought that was an interesting thought, because I think for most of us, I think there are ways that we can still do what we need, get get the lumber, get all that kind of stuff, but do it in a manageable, sustainable way. I think that's one of our, things that as a society, we're going to have to figure out how to do over the next, basically the duration, really, if we're going to, not burn ourselves out on this planet. But so I thought that was interesting. I think from the eco warriors, eco terrorists, whatever you want to call them, I think from some standpoint, I think it was somewhat of it was just more of he was observing, like he took these group of people that had nothing to do with any of this and how they evolved into this. Now look what we're doing. Now we're going and chaining ourselves up on logging roads. And again, you take these people from all these different various backgrounds, and I think that's kind of part of that, creating to that. But then you have where they even go one step further, and to the point where now where they're destroying and everything else. And I don't know that he really took a stance on that, other than the fact that he lets it play out over the timeline, and then they have to bear the repercussions of what they did. So I don't think he's saying that it is a positive thing. And then, as you guys have mentioned, in the long term, what was the overall effect? It didn't change anything. So there's got to be a better way, I guess, is really that's what I took from it. There's got to be a better way.
He does lionize the social outcasts and the rebels who can or do think differently. You know, to get back, if someone's listening and saying, this sounds an awful lot like a lecture on ecology and making me feel bad, it's a story. And this part of it, these people that come together was part of the story I really liked from storytelling. It was almost like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. These people from all over the world get the calling. And the calling is nature, and it brings them together in ways they did not see. So that part of the plot I found fascinating and worked for me. I found it very compelling.
See, and you mentioned that it didn't, Jeff too, mentioned that it didn't result in anything. And what I thought was interesting was that it felt like the actual acts of violence were kind of the short-term kind of firework in the ether. People were aware of it because it was shocking, and you know, there was someone died and nobody knew who it was, and there was this mystery around who it was. But it was a very fast, it burned out really quickly. Right. And then they were just going through their lives wondering if they would ever get caught. And it was only when they got caught later on, years into the future, that I thought the story kind of left with a little bit of a hopeful is the wrong term, but when one of the characters is caught and has to go before a judge and face a judge and say, I did this thing and this is why I did it, and what are what's the punishment? It's almost like that generated more of an impact, because people around the world were seeing this one person stand up for something they had believed in. And even though it had happened years into the past, he was now saying, you know what, I did do that and I should pay the penalty, but also I'm not wrong.
Right. I think I can't remember the exact term he used, but something like it was like time will tell. Like basically, you know, he had this chance to make a statement, and it was like time will tell if what I did was right. You know. And
there was this happens often in the book when in my review of it, things that happened late that I'm puzzling over. The answer was at the beginning, or if not the answer, a lens with which to view what finally happened was there early. And there was a line, page 115, the only dependable things are humility and looking. And it just occurred to me that that's sort of what he's getting at when he's on trial there. And he says, time will tell, you know, and, you know, I'll take the consequence. It's finally come. I knew it was coming, and we'll watch.
Yeah. This is probably the part of the show where we should check and do a beer check. Is everyone okay?
Yeah. Yes.
When you go with a big West Coast IPA, you can make it through a whole show.
You can make it last.
But can I just say what I was going to drink if I was all the way through my Trevon? I've been so busy talking and listening, I forgot to drink.
Yeah.
That's rare. That doesn't happen that often.
Absolutely.
But I did have a Bottle Logic that Jeff brought me, because I thought that term Bottle Logic fit the book as well. That the human capacity to bottle up all logic, to see what we want to see, hear what we want to hear, and confirm our biases.
That's pretty much the last 4 years of our lives, I think, in a lot of ways. We've seen numerous examples of that.
Yeah, it really does feel like kind of a new day, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
So one thing I think that makes it hard to do a book club about this book is that there are so many concepts that maybe that deserve attention, but don't necessarily allow for very specific, like, hey, what is the book saying moments. And one of those topics I did want to bring up is, do words gain power when they're spoken aloud or when they're seen? And that's kind of a recurring theme. One of our characters is an artist, and he paints words on the sides of buildings, and he paints these protest slogans on different things, and uses that art form to try to create a mythology around the trees that they're trying to protect. And trees in particular are found quite a bit throughout myth, in all religions and in all continents. Kind of there's the tree of life, there's the world tree connecting the heavens and humanity, and then the underworld, wishing trees. And you see that in a lot of different medias. Really popular book, now turned TV show, American Gods, is all based around the world tree. I just saw this great movie called The Sunlit Night, which is brings into that concept of trees as their own sort of myth. And so I'm wondering, do the trees in this book, because there's so many of them, whether it's the American chestnut tree or it's the redwood trees, do they deserve their own mythology? Does that mythology benefit them in the long run in this book? And do the words spoken about those trees have a power that maybe Richard Powers, hey, connection, that maybe Richard Powers is trying to say with almost like a billboard, like, hey, look at these trees. There's more to them than it's just a tree. And I think there's several characters in the book who have moments where they go, especially I think Ray and Dorothy, the married couple, who really seem like their own story for almost the whole thing. But at some point, they see this tree in their yard through the window, and it's like they had never seen it before, and it becomes this whole world to them. And so I'm wondering if you guys could speak to that, the power of words and the power of myth involving nature.
So, I mean, I'll go real quick on that. I think, and one of the things you talked about, if explaining to someone about this book is, I think if you read this book and there's so many different layers to the book, but I don't think you can look at trees the same way again, really. And I think that's where the power comes from, is that whether it's the tree out in your front yard or whether you're up in the redwoods, you will look at a tree now, and as you said, they're not just something there. We're connected, right? And that whole concept of the fact that they, that they communicate with each other, that they are, they ask for help when they need help. When there's an issue, they defend themselves, and all these types of things that I guess when you break it down makes it, but those are things that you don't, I think on a daily basis, you don't really think about. So I think from that standpoint, I think it really, it was fascinating. And I that was the first thing as I started reading this, I'm like, wow, trees are monumental. And I think the few times for me personally, I'll get those feelings as I think about like going to say like Yellowstone or going to the redwoods or something like that. And you stand and these giants, right. And you do have this sense of awe there, and that there is something bigger. But I thought that was really neat. I think he was able to kind of evoke those emotions and some of those sentiments, through his written words, so I thought he did a good job with that.
A lit major, English lit teacher, so does mythology and symbolism have power? That's my whole world. So yes. One of my favorite lectures is tree symbolism. Since I've read this book, I've now ordered, not only have I busted out all my old field guides of birds and bugs, but I've ordered field guides on trees and tree mythology and symbolism. I've ordered some new books, and my wife's going to be delighted. And the irony does not escape me that trees were used to make those books that I ordered, and they will be shipped in cardboard. Yeah. I do have some guilt about that.
Can I, real quick, Jeff, before I want you to continue that thought, but I want to tell you something I wrote down. Before the book even starts, it says that the Overstory is printed on 100% recycled paper. By using recycled paper in place of paper made with 100% virgin fiber, this paperback has saved 637 trees. And I wrote, not accurate, because it could have not been printed at all. All the savings. But anyway, sorry, back to you.
That said, having teaching online digitally this year, I am so tired of reading on a screen. It's such a pleasure to have a book in my lap and to flip a page and to dog ear a corner. But I did want to say, we read a few months ago, not for this recording, but we read Richard Preston's The Wild Trees. And that really affected my appreciation for this book. So this book is thick. If you are fascinated by ecology, if you've ever wondered why when you take a walk in the woods you feel better, and you do, this book helps tell a story that explains that without it being a textbook. Some people can just read a textbook. I understand that, but I can't. But I would highly recommend reading Richard Preston's The Wild Trees first. It reads very quickly, but it gave me some understanding of tree life, tree interwoven dependency on each other, what's happening in a canopy, what's happening in the roots, that really set me up for reading this book and appreciating it even more. So you could probably throw some Walden in there in that reading list too before you walk into this one.
I was going to say, just coincidentally, before we started this book club, just a month or so before, I read a book called The Hidden Life of Trees, which I found in a random lending library in the neighborhood by a guy named Peter Wollenben. And it's called The Hidden Life of Trees, What They Feel, How They Communicate, Discoveries from a Secret World. And it is actually kind of the middle ground between this book and Richard Preston's The Wild Trees, where it's based in reality. It's a nonfiction book about what does happen in trees and what happens in the canopies from a scientific perspective, but it does it by telling it's a scientist going, you know what, no one's going to get this if I don't give them a story, which comes out in this book as well with our scientist Patricia Westerfield, who at one point she mentions that her advisors and her editors say don't give people the numbers when you give a speech about trees, when you talk about nature. They don't care about the numbers, they'll glaze over. But she does it almost compulsively because the numbers are so overwhelming to her, which I thought was really interesting. This seems like a good point to ask, but do you guys have a tree in your own life that in the history of your life that maybe had an impact on you? It was something I thought about while I was reading this, and in my head, I had one tree that I immediately thought of. And then as I started thinking about it, I started going, it wasn't intentional, but I was like, oh, like there was actually this other tree that had an impact on me. And then this one, and as I started to think about it, I was made more aware of it. So I'm curious if you guys have a tree that stands out as having had an impact on your life.
You know, it's tough to say. I mean, I don't know that I would say I can think of an individual tree. Like I said, I think it's more about places with trees. Would for me would be, you know, bigger. Like I said, going to national parks or going, you know, where you're camping and that kind of thing of being more out in the wilderness. And I think that maybe some of that's where I grew up. Right, I grew up in Southern California, where you know, we have I think a lot more concrete than we have trees now. So it's kind of sad, but at the same point, that makes you appreciate it a lot when you go to a place where it is, you know, all trees. Like I remember one of the first times driving into Montana, and I was just blown away because all I could see was green, and it was just the top of trees everywhere as far as you looked. You know, I do find that, but I do find now too that when I do that, I appreciate trees more, and I think some of it too from this. Even just reading these books, but also just in general, because we don't have them. They're not everywhere here, right? Here we have our eucalyptus now and palm trees. We have lots of palm trees, but you don't seem to have these great oaks and all these other things, you know, where I grew up. So
I've certainly been more aware of trees too. Everywhere I walk now, every other day I take a long walk, and get to a certain age, can't run anymore, can't play sports anymore at any competitive level. So I just walk, and now I walk and I look and paying attention to tree branches stretching. This was happening after we had wild trees, but even more now, like that tree's talking to that tree. Cause look at the way that root system is set up, and seeing what's nesting up in trees. You know, my grandparents lived in North Fork, California. He worked for the Forest Service, so which was woven pretty tightly in with the logging industry, probably still is, but certainly was in the 1970s. And they lived in the oak tree level, so their house was surrounded by oak trees. And we'd drive up, and he'd show me, this is the tree line. Notice how they're all turning into pine trees now. And then he would point that stuff out. So very much a child, and then going to the logging jamborees, which I thought the lumberjacks were heroes. I mean, they were so cool. They had beards like Ryan's. They threw axes. They were just awesome. So when you asked that question, that's where my mind went right away, was that part of my childhood, which I really hadn't thought about for a long time. I thank you for that question. It gave me a stroll down memory lane.
It was one that I asked myself, and I have a list of just different trees in my life that have impacted me. And it was almost shocking to me that there were so many. And it was just very unusual. The other day I was walking near a park here in Carlsbad, and I saw someone else observing the tree. There's this huge tree that actually has a little fence around it, so you don't get too close because it's old and a little bit fragile. It's a massive tree in the park here, and you can just reach over the fence and touch the leaves there. It's big enough that it does that. And there was a gentleman there, and he was doing that. He was looking at the tree and he was feeling it and just kind of observing it, and it was so noticeable because it felt like some of these characters that I read in this book. And it felt like something that when I'm walking, actually since starting this book, when I'm walking in the neighborhood or something like that, and I pass close enough by a tree, I'll reach out a hand and touch it, and touch the bark on it and just see how it feels, and make it a more tactile experience than just an observational one. And that's been a change over the past few weeks that it took to read this book. We're kind of coming up on an hour, so I'm going to start wrapping things around, I guess. The book actually ends with a phrase called "This will never end," that says "This will never end." And so I'm wondering what you guys think Powers is referring to there, if it's the never-ending push and pull of the argument of nature versus humanity. And I guess if the ending that we get is rarely the ending we expect, which is something I would say happened to most of these characters. I think at one point in the book, they all had a very clear vision of what their future entailed, and for none of them, it ended up that way. And so what happens, what is that? What do we think Powers is talking about there? And what happens if it does end, when we run out of time, when we can't figure our way out of whatever mess we create?
I really feel like he wants that duplicity of meaning there. This human stubbornness will not end, but also that nature goes on. Humans, you're making a decision about the quality of your existence on this planet. The planet goes on. So I felt, I liked that it had that double. They also had ended with that word "still," just STILL, without explanation, or a little bit earlier than that, and I felt it had the same double purpose.
Yeah, no, I would echo with you. I think it's that, how do we coexist? I think that's really at the core of all of this. I mean, you read through it, whatever side you come down on, whatever part speaks to you. We are coexisting, but we have to learn how to coexist probably even better, in terms of how we proceed going forward with regards to the environment, and with regards to things like climate change and those types of things. It's not sustainable to continue to do what we have been doing, and I think for the most part, most people are finally aware of that. But again, it's taking that next step, and how do you implement and do it in a way that's going to be positive for all sides, I thought I was reading through some reviews on it, and there was an interesting, someone had said a thing basically just saying that, I thought this was kind of an interesting quote on it, but whatever, it was like that forests must be preserved or nature will have its revenge. And that's a little chilling, but it's true. It's very true. And I think that's at the core of all this, is that we have to figure out a way to do it and do it right, or they're going to outlast us. So
yeah, it's more they'll wait us out. It's not even a revenge. It's like
timeline, right?
Yeah, right.
I think there actually was, I wrote down, I think of page 90, there was a quote by, was it Douglas? And he basically just says, as he's, as he was replanting the clear cuts up in Oregon, he was, he says he would say goodbye to each of his little plants as he would put them into the ground. And he basically says, hang on, only 10 or 20 decades, child's play for you guys. You just have to outlast us. And then no one will be left to F you over. And that's, kind of that timeline right there, is that, if we don't do it right, that's what will happen. They will outlast us in some form.
I guess that's where I get the hopefulness of the book. Yeah. It's not hopeful for humans, but it's hopeful for nature. And I don't want to give something away. Someone's going to dedicate this time now to this book. I want some surprises left, but Plant Patty has an epiphany of what to dedicate her life to. And I think that tells you, hey, trees can last and they can wait, and their seeds can wait thousands of years before they need to sprout. And I think it had that. Do you guys remember the old book from Robert Heinlein, the Stranger in a Strange Land sci-fi book?
I know the name, but I honestly have no recollection. I don't know that I've read it.
Middle school reading, but he had a verb in there, to grok, to understand something on a personal, on an academic, on a spiritual level, to have a full, comprehensive relationship understanding of things, or of someone or something. And that seemed to be, that was something that this book's trying to get across. How can you humans wrap their brain around the enormity of
Right.
and go back to that word interwovenness of the natural world and our place in it. And it's not something that comes easy to us, and our lives are too short to really see it. So unless we change that whole way we experience, I even like that idea of the tactile experience, then it's just something that we will continue to, I guess the academic term is poo-poo.
Well, when I was thinking about it as you guys were talking, but there's almost this teeter-totter when we're talking about, one of you mentioned what side you come down on, whether it's on the nature or humanity side or climate change, not climate change side. And it's just a matter of having enough people on one side that either you just decide, if does one side need to win, or do we need to find a balance on that belief scale so that things continue without getting either worse or start getting better. And where are we on a teeter-totter with other humans, or are we on a teeter-totter with nature? Are we on a multifaceted matrix style, dimensional teeter-totter? And where do you as a person fall into that scale?
Right. And in our worldview, even that word balance shows our selfishness isn't the right word, but our egocentric. Balance says, how do I get some of what I want and nature gets some of what it wants, versus where's my role in the natural comprehensive scheme of the world? Where's my lane?
Right.
Versus how do I get what I want without wrecking everything?
Well, and the other part of it is has it been so unbalanced for so long now that maybe it needs to be skewed the other way now to try and, to kind of even to get more balance or get back to balance. I think probably that's more likely. We are so probably out of balance with regards to the humanity side of it versus the nature side of it, that it's going to have to go the other way for a while to kind of get ourselves back to an area of sustainability.
Well, and that could be applied to so many things, whether it's race relations or politics or nature, nurture. And so I think the last thing that I'll have to ask you then is, it's a multi-part question, like every question I've asked today. Did you like the book, and would you recommend it? And if you would recommend it, how would you describe it to somebody in a very quick one sentence, something to say, hey, I think you'd like this, and this is what it's about?
So I'll say from my standpoint, I actually did really enjoy the book. I like books. I think it was well written and had, with the characters and everything else in terms of it made it feel like it was fictional, right? And it was fiction, but it made it feel like it was a story and that part of it. But I also like the fact that it did make me think a lot. I found myself going back and rereading passages and stuff like that. And I think I've said that in the past. That's not normally the type of reader I am. I'll just motor through stuff. So when I find a book that really makes me think, I do really enjoy that. And so I think this is a book that I will keep for a long time, as far as to reference and say, hey, and that would lead into the recommending part of it. I think I would definitely recommend this book. I would say, with the caveat though, same type of thing. What type of reader are you? I think there are probably a lot of readers that would quit on this book early on if they aren't able to kind of plod through certain parts or kind of just have that stamina to get through, and I think everybody will find a part where it may happen right in the first, in Nicholas's part of it, or it might not be for a couple of stories. But that I think people, once you get into it, once you kind of, when it hits that switch, you will enjoy it. I think everybody can get something out of it on different levels. And I think in terms of, like you talk about, how would I explain it to someone, as I would just go back to that. I think if you'll look at your place in the natural world differently after you read this, because I think it is eye opening, and in terms of where that is, that whole, where we us versus, I won't say versus trees, but us in relations to trees, I guess is what I would say. I think it's a pretty right on the top. It says monumental is in the quote on the top from Barbara Kingsolver, and I think it is. It's pretty much it's a monumental work when you're talking about within the scope of that.
And I will say, I love this book. There are parts about the construct of it that aren't smooth or easy. I didn't mind, about 100 page. Ryan put out the clarion call. He said, I'm at page 100 and I'm hooked. And I was on page 12, not hooked. But I knew it. I'm like, okay. And then I found my place where I was hooked. So, I know which people I recommend this book to, and you do need some reading stamina, but also you just need to be told, go into it with some reading stamina. It will pay off. I want books at this point in my life that make me better in some way. It could be the turn of phrase, the use of, it doesn't have to be any big way. I want books that let me see things, understand things differently. I got that out of this. And if I had to give it a sales pitch to someone, I think I'd go with It's Close Encounters of the Third Kind meets Walden meets Avatar meets Silent Spring.
Yeah, it's very Avatarish. I agree with you. It's like a real world Avatar. That's a good description of it.
I would recommend it to someone and describe it as saying it was approved by the I Like Beer book club, and they'd be like, well, then I'm going to read
there
it.
you go.
Yeah.
And it's golden. There's no question about it.
Enjoy with a Mother Earth or a virgin beer.
Virgin Trivana, yes.
Yeah. You might need a bottle of whiskey. I probably would go with whiskey with this one myself. I don't think I liked the book, but I'm glad that I read it. You mentioned, Jeff, Riccitelli, that it's one you would keep and go back to. I don't know that I will go back to this book. I think I'll pass it along. There are books in my life that I go back to time and time again. I don't know that this is one of them, but I do think that I'm grateful that I picked it up and that I read it and I followed it through. And it was also a lesson in reading for me a little bit, because it really did take me 99 pages to get to that point where I thought I want to continue. And there are so many things in our life that we've been taught that makes it difficult to appreciate the grand scale of trees, because everything is so short, whether it's video gaming on your phone or Instagram or social media or even the news. The timeline of news is so fast. I mean, I look at the news 10 times a day and it's something different every single time. And at some point you go, well, if I just take the weekend off, does it really matter? Because it just becomes this flow of news. And so
go the other way, just the weekends on.
Weekends on, there's a good idea. So with this book, I was glad that I read it. It made me wonder what my life would be like maybe if I wasn't, I don't want to say the age I am so far into it, but I would say that I'm at the point in my relationship with my wife and my family that I am. Because that, to me, it was an interesting thing, the eco warrior versus terrorist kind of idea. How far do you go if other people depend on you?
Right.
Yes.
And I thought Nicholas was an interesting character because he was inspired by someone else to join this movement, and his love for her really brought him into this on a passionate level. And Adam was someone who got into it on his own, and then later in his life developed relationships and then ultimately had to answer for them. And the choice to take on those repercussions is different depending on where you're at in your life. And there's a tendency, I think, for people to dismiss young people's opinions of things. But one benefit to being young is that you have the advantage of being unattached to a lot of things. You haven't built a foundation so much, so you're not burning as much down if you decide to go that route.
Or as this author might say, unaware of your attachments.
Right. You're unaware of your attachments. You assume those attachments that you have with your parents or your brothers and sisters or friends will last forever, when the reality is even in our shorter compared to trees lifespan, it's still a long time. And things change, and so that's a really interesting thing. So I would recommend it, but I would agree with you that I would caveat it to the reader.
Yeah.
I would recommend it to somebody who really liked James Michener, for example.
Yeah, I agree. It's very Michener. I would say that's true.
If you liked reading Caribbean or Alaska,
Yep.
I'm going to give you this book. And where I had trouble with some of those books, I think just because of some of the datedness of them being just before my time, this kind of feels like a Michener for my time.
It very much so. And that's actually funny because I thought of that right off the bat, as it plays out very much like a Michener, where you start back with nothing, and as he just builds from nothing to and at that very beginning of it, it's so plodding in his books to get to the juice of the story, so, but I love miniature books. So Caribbean, Alaska, Texas is one of my favorite books of all time. So it's right in my wheelhouse.
The other thing that they do similarly is that they kind of insert themselves as the author into the narrative sometimes with some narrative description of what's happening. And like, here's a story about a kid from Iowa. And then all of a sudden, here's like, the narrator's kind of describing to you like the 10,000-year history of a particular tree. And you're like, well, wait a minute.
No, totally.
How do these two things work together? But they do. And he goes from there. So, well, that's I think 3 recommends for this particular book club. And we should probably talk about what we're doing next.
Absolutely. Next month, talking about books, you said coming back to a book or revisiting a book. We're going to revisit Kurt Vonnegut Jr.'s Slaughterhouse-Five.
You don't want to give us the whole title?
Children's Crusade, if I'm going from memory there.
That's a book that I'm really excited that we're going to do, because I think I've owned maybe 50 copies of that book. And I only have one right now because I buy them. Someone tells me they haven't read it and I give it to them, and then I have to buy a new one. It's a recurring cycle.
That's healthier than my cycle of buying every copy of Hamlet I ever find and then keeping it to myself.
I used to be a book hoarder. There was a time early on in my marriage where we were moving from an apartment to an apartment, and everything I owned fit into my car, except I had to get a storage unit for my books.
Nice.
And there was a point where we just said, this is a lot of weight to carry around. And so we started passing them on. But someday I really appreciate the idea that I can read a book and pass it on and know that if I really need it again, I can find it. It'll come back to me.
Ryan, thank you for your choice of book this month. I enjoyed the read. I even enjoyed more stretching my worldview and this conversation. I think we all know now what we need to do to save the natural world, and by doing so, save ourselves. Or at least, isn't it pretty to think so?
And I am exhausted, and I think I do need that second beer.
There you go.
I have another meeting to get to, so I think I will. I think I'm going to do the same thing because it's not a work meeting.
Well, cheers to you both.
Yeah,
thanks for indulging me with this long read.
All right.
Thank you. Cheers and good night.
Cheers.